Yes.
So, as I understood, this course, the two parallels, were advanced courses in German and French.
Right.
And the materials that the students were studying at an advanced level in French or German.
That's correct.
But when they got together, they spoke in English.
Exactly. And so this is, again, this is something that, you know, I know there are some language sections in my own department with which, and they will remain unnamed for the purposes of this talk, in which these types of initiatives would never fly because anything, even dedicating 4 weeks to something other than the language is unthinkable. And I'm like, okay, fine, sure, whatever. That's not how I roll, but if you think that, fine. I think there is room without necessarily undermining the integrity of the language course as a language course, or as a course in the language, where you can actually make these things happen. So you're exactly right. The 3 weeks leading up to the common meeting, the students were reading parallel kinds of documents, each in the national language, so French and German, and then when we met, we spoke in English, even though they had to somehow sometimes refer to their own, to the other idiom just to explain what they had learned. You know, why in French they say it that way? Because it has this sort of, you know, symbolic value behind it. But the materials were in English, and then, for the movies, for example, in French and German with subtitles, and then the discussions were in English.
Just continue the same question. How many out of 15 weeks the students were in their target languages?
11. Right? 11 and a half, really, because the last time they met was just one session when we did the conclusion. And then the other time was the two sessions of that week were dedicated to the common meeting. So 3 weeks in French, 1 week in English, 3 weeks in French, we read something.
By the way, it's an outstanding work.
Thank you. It's really not that hard. I mean, all it takes is two like-minded partners and a little bit of goodwill and just a little bit of work, and off you go. And I guess the main, maybe the most difficult work conceptually is finding the right theme. Again, it's true of the students, but it's also true of us, is how do we ask the right question? What is the one, and it's not the one, because there's others we could have chosen, but what would be one very pertinent organizing topic for this particular class? And then after that, finding materials is just a matter of spending a few hours on the web and asking around, talking to people, and finding how to best buttress again, Jim G calls it resourcing learning. How are we going to best resource learning for our students? Because at the end of the day, access to knowledge is, everybody has a smartphone and Google. Access to knowledge is a given, at least in our privileged, Western world. Now, access to questioning is a different issue. So, how we're going to best resource learning so that the students can start formulating the right questions. That's the hard part. Once you have that, the rest of it is just a bit of work.
Let's stick with the question about the language issue. When I came in just a little bit late, and I thought, oh my God, how wonderful that bilingual French and German students and bilingual instructors. This is that. Now, you can sell me on that.
Mm-hmm. Now, that would be even better.
Oh, fantastic. What I'm wondering is what happens the day they go back into their German and or French section. And you have to somehow, you know, do a little bit of work past what just happened. Doesn't it get mixed up in an English? I don't know what the German French.
Not so much, because the choice is either they're coming out of that class back into all French, or they're coming out of, you know, intro to biology into French. So,
But still, isn't the discussion, doesn't it need to continue to be about what the French people had to say? And I don't necessarily have the vocabulary in German to talk about what they were talking about. And so it becomes really kind of monstrous as the semester goes on to incorporate where we were last week. And we were able to talk so much, and because there's all these different levels of the 3,000 level German to French. You can't tell me they're all here.
oh no. We have very various levels. Two things. One is there is so much overlap in the materials that we're reading. Not so much in the reading the same thing, but reading about the same thing. That the lexical set is actually not as large as you think. And two, my experience is that the students are much more likely to want to learn that vocabulary than they are to learn any vocabulary that I might put in front of them, because it corresponds to a very vivid, lived experience that they had in the classroom. So if I said, hey, you know, last week we were talking about the Wirtschaftswunder in German, and this is how you say it in French, right? And because of the fact that they are actually plugging it in a conversation that may actually have resonated with them very deeply, they're a lot more likely to remember le miracle économique than they would remembering something that I would want them to learn. So, so yes, it is a very intensive class to teach, and it's a very intensive class to be in. But for those students for whom it is to whom it speaks, they actually don't mind the work. When I did these kinds of things with projects where I had students make movies, I had students make websites, I had students make all kinds of publicly available projects, products, texts. When I asked them to report the amount of time that they spent on building these things, it is far above and beyond anything they would have been ready to commit if I'd asked them to write a paper. And for some reason, they don't seem to mind. And so it's part of the whole plan. It's very perverse. It's part of the whole plan is to make them do. It's really learning by doing. As long as you can make your students do, not because you ask them to, but because they want to do, then you can bet your stamp collection and a chocolate bar that the product is going to be better than what you thought. The iBooks collection of short stories, they were done by the time it was so intense, because I met with each of them 3 times individually for an hour over the course of the semester. Nitpicking, I had a student that said, you still need to send me your final version because I want to nitpick to death about it. And her response was, how much more dead do you want it to be? And I said, oh, just you wait. Right? But she did it, and they all did it. But for a story that was 5 pages or less, they spent hours upon hours upon hours writing and rewriting and finding the right expression and the right tense and the right everything. But if I had asked them to write me a 5-page story done at the end of the semester, they would have done it as an overnighter, and they might even have resented it. Whereas in this case, I don't think I hardly ever got higher student evaluations than on that particular course, where I worked them into the ground. But they didn't mind, because they were writing their own story about who they were and who they wanted to be in French, right? And so you have to, that's the secret, I think. So you have to get your students into a social learning environment where they want to do. And if you can do that, then it's a winning combination, because they will work endlessly to make a project or a product that they're proud of, right? And the learning, I would argue, in this case is tenfold what they would have done in a more traditional setting, probably. Right? You have this, I don't know if you're familiar with, there's a researcher by the name of Rebecca Black who has looked at fan fiction. And she tells she found these kids who are immigrants into the US who write tens of thousands of words worth of novels online in good English while they're flunking high school English. Now, how is that? Because they're online, they write their stuff, it's their story, they're riffing on Harry Potter or whoever, and they get feedback from their readers saying, well, you know, if I were you, I wouldn't say this that way or that way. And so they work on that. And they produce this massive opera online while they're flunking high school English. That makes no sense at all, right? So we need to find ways to bridge this gap between making students want to do something so that they can do it in a foreign language.
I have a couple questions, but it just sounds like a fascinating endeavor all around. And I love that this kind of embraces a lot of constructivist tenets, you know, kind of engaging the students to construct meaning for themselves authentically, which leads to a lot more motivation that you might get than you might get from your typical kind of boilerplate syllabus. But since what a lot of what you seem to be focusing on, you know, where your classes are, has to do with this kind of fluid negotiation of identity, and how, you know, the students are kind of constructing their own connection to these somewhat abstract ideas. So here comes the assessment question, right? How do you assess this kind of production? How do you find out who's getting it and who's not getting it? And how can you ameliorate that? Or is that even within the scope of what's possible?
I don't really assess anything. No, I'm just kidding.
You know.
Now that is a very good question. So obviously assessment depends on the class, for starters, what it is you want to assess and how you assess it. So in a class like this, the French-German class where they're talking about culture a lot, and at the end they had, so the students have to build these sort of larger project. I assess it exactly the same way a qualitative researcher would assess a data set and try to interpret what's going on, right? So for those of you who are maybe not as familiar with qualitative research, this is, you know, obviously the kind of research that takes as its primary source of data text or discourses, loosely defined, so either interview, participant, observation, data, the things that you write down, various kinds of documents, and so on and so on. And the idea is to establish a convincing chain of evidence. Right? So what do I mean by that is that as a researcher, you go and you try to account for behaviors at the supermarket as to how people choose a line to check out of. Right? And so you're, you know, plumping yourself here on a chair and you're looking at people as they come to the checkout line, and you're looking at how they are choosing to go in line 7 versus line 12 or whatever. And so you're observing this, and based on these observations, you have to somehow infer or deduce what sort of factors are presiding at their choice. And so one way of doing it is that, you know, you make a hypothesis, and a good way of doing it would be to give them a survey, and then to go and interview them and say, well, I saw you were here, and then you hesitated, you went to the 2 steps to the right, and then you went 3 steps to the left, and you ended up in line 14. Why did you do that? It seemed like, you know, you looked at the number of people, but if you had looked at what they had in their cart, maybe you would have thought that line 7 was, you get the idea. And so for this types of project, this is exactly how I proceed. I have journal data, I have interview data. I tend to interview students at midterm and at the end of the term, and then I have their final product and projects, so what they produced in the class. And based on all of this, I have to make an educated assessment of how much they got it. Did they got it A worth of work? Did they got it A B plus worth of work, or B? And you're like, well, that's completely subjective, you might say. And I will say, yeah, but no more subjective or less subjective than a grade. Because I don't know if you know, I hope I'm not going to shatter any myth by saying this, but grades are entirely subjective. Even if you test with all multiple choice, or you give students verb paradigms and you say, okay, conjugate all this in the passé composé. Right, yeah, highly measurable. Does that measure their ability to function in French? No. So.
What about introducing a rubrics that,
Yes.
you spend the amount of time on to say what's really a superior project,
Exactly.
what's a really superior interview, etc., so that they learn as they're doing what they haven't accomplished yet, and why they're getting a 2 as opposed to a 4, what they need to do then in the steps to get there. I mean, I think that's what assessment really
So we do have rubrics, but rubrics never define. I mean, the text in rubrics. I'm not sure we have that kind of time, but rubrics make me laugh.
You have something to qualify this. Otherwise, you're just shoving the papers down the stairs like they always used to do.
Yeah.
And figuring out which one lands on lane A, which one lands on lane B,
Have you-
which one lands on lane C.
It's cultural learning we're talking about, or language learning. So have you seen the text of rubrics? Students demonstrate excellent mastery of the language
Yeah, but that's
in
not
a
the kind of-
lexical,
that's not the kind of-
grammatical
But that's
way.
not the kind of project you're talking about.
No.
You're talking about being able to communicate this set of.
Exactly. So, but they're doing it in the foreign language. So the rubric looks something like this, but at least mine do. So you have, you're grading for 6 or 7 criteria. So one of them is, accuracy of language, and so students, display excellent mastery, adequate mastery, average mastery, and so then you have you get to the notion of cultural understanding. Students, one of the areas for cultural learning is the ability to show empathy, right? And so students have demonstrated, consistently demonstrated empathy for the foreign culture in their paper, versus less empathy versus no empathy. Like, okay, so according to what scale?
Yeah, but that's just a bad rubric. You have to have a rubric that's based on what your goals for the course are, and give the students a model inside the rubric that lets them know what they have to do to attain these, to show empathy. What does that mean? And that has to be in your rubric. And if it isn't, then the students aren't getting enough feedback for this project to really let them know whether they've learned it or not, or whether they're just getting graded for having finished.
Right, and so
I know, I do these projects all the time, and it's really, really
it
tough.
is tricky,
But all
and I will
you
argue
feel like
that.
You've got to give them a passing grade because they
And some of them won't pass. But you have to understand that when you go for this kind of project, for this kind of rubric, it is no more objective or no more subjective than any other form of grading. Because when you get from the language of rubrics, however, and I've looked at hundreds of rubrics that are held as good examples of rubric, and it is still a mystery to me how you go from the language and the rubric to a numerical value. Because I can do the language and the rubric. I can do the qualitative analysis of the data that I have in front of me and make an assessment that I'm confident in, that I know whether a student actually shows empathy or doesn't, right? Or if their identity shifted, their sense of identity shifted, or if it didn't. Now, did it shift well enough to get a B or a C or an A? I don't make. I make this kind of decision. Am I confident in making this kind of decision? Up to a point. Up to a point. When the most convincing things I've seen about grading was a study that was done in France. I think I want to say maybe 10 years ago, about exactly this, about grades. And with this idea that, of course, the protocol of the study was to show how many graders did you need for the marginal grader not to change the cumulative average grade of an exam, right? So by that I mean that they sent the same exams to a bunch of teachers, and they said grade, and then they averaged for each exam. They looked at how many graders you needed for that particular exam for the marginal grader not to change the average you had, the cumulative average you had up to that point, right? So everybody thought, well, that's easy. We're going to find that math is just one, because math is math is math. And so it's always the same grade. And then philosophy is going to be on the other end of the spectrum because nobody knows what they're talking about. As it turns out, they were right. Math did have the fewest number of graders for the marginal grader not to change the grade of that particular exam. But you know what that number was? 9. It takes 9 teachers of mathematics to get a reliable grade for the same exam. And then you're going to come and tell me that with any instrument, you can make a judgment for assessment purposes that you're 100% confident in when you talk about cultural learning? Because I don't think so. I try to make the best instrument that I know how to make based on the available research on assessment for these kinds of things. But you are not going to convince me that you can make something that reliably measures
So you do
these
this
things.
subjectively instead?
No, I try to do it objectively because the students demand it, and I owe it to them. But to transfer cultural learning from its very nature, which is ever changing anyway, to a numerical value. First of all, I find no value in it, but I also don't have a 100% confidence that I'm giving the students the grade that they deserve that day. And now, if you want to really get tricky on this, look at all the studies that have been done on assembling learner corpora of the language, right? Because as we know in all of our language courses, that regardless of levels, there are moments where we do assessment. It's like, okay, well, this day you're going to have chapter 3 test. Or you're going to have, I'm going to give you an exam on what you've studied up until that point in midterm for any number of courses. But then when you learn at what learners can do from week 1 to week 15, then you find that some of them are like this. With regard to particular aspects of what you've taught them. So week 1 they have it, week 3 they don't have it anymore, week 7 they have it again, week 9 it's called free variation, right? Well, if you happen to give the test on the day that little John has, is the week where he actually remembers that structure, good for him. And then you say, oh yeah, John remembers. John really did his work, he's a good student. Yeah, but if you had given him the test the week after, he might have not remembered. And so even with these very quote-unquote objective tests, you realize that on actual language learning data, you have very little reliable information. Because in order to assess anything that resembles language development, you will need to look at this kind of data that no one in their right mind has time to do, so that you can reliably say, yeah, look at that. John, for the first 7 weeks of the semester, that structure or that lexical set or that aspect concept, that seems to come and go. But look at that, week 8 and week 8 onward, on every assessment measure that I give him, it's there. So he's acquired it. I know that, right?
I just have a comment. I don't know whether I'm buying that fully, but if I'm about to put another stereotypes about French, I would definitely say the grades of French professors are done subjectively.
But you can't.
Wow.
You can't have.
Well, none of them are here, right?
Yes.
So, go right
Go
ahead,
ahead.
sir.
No, but I don't mean to just this assessment entirely, because we need to assess, because we need to make sure that we give, it's also a way to assess your teaching, to make sure that that your students are learning what it is you want to teach them. But I would argue that I really want to dismantle the myth that there is one way to adjudicate a 100% reliable grade. I don't care what assessment measure you're in. I mean, look at all the debates in educational research about standardized testing. You cannot do any more objective than standardized testing. And yet, study after study has shown that it is completely culturally biased, that it is completely XYZ, and it doesn't give you a reliable assessment of what it is you're trying to measure, because it is not repeatable across time, setting, and cultural community. So, based on that, looking at culture is a completely different ballgame. So I don't want the things that I want to come here and tell you, oh yeah, I found a 100% reliable way of measuring cultural learning. You think things like Bennett's intercultural sensitivity scale has any valid and reliable way of measuring intercultural development? Because it doesn't. And they have a whole battery of questions in this, and you score this, but you give the same test to the same student 3 weeks later, and they score entirely differently. Because they've learned other things, they forgot some things, they had a bad experience in their lives, and all of a sudden that community is just a bunch of idiots. And so, of course it varies, right? But you cannot give your students the impression that you're attributing grades subjectively, because then they'd be at my office door all the time. And they're not, because I'm trying hard to document the grade that my students are getting. So there is a rubric for every assessment measure, for every project, for participation, for everything that they do, so that they understand what kind of performance they need to maintain to get that grade. Do I get it right all the time? I don't think so. You had a second question.
I do want to kind of be respectful of everybody's time, and I seem to have opened what is a very reliable Pandora's box. So my apologies for that for that little tangent there. That's always something that's worth exploring, but it is inevitably going to lead us to drink, which is something that maybe we should start thinking about in the near future.
Yes, that's what it is, to drink heavily.
We would like to kind of invite you to stay for some wine and cheese if anybody can find the time. Before we kind of make that transition, I would just want to give the opportunity for any of us to ask one more question that's non-assessment related. No? And if not? Oh.
Have you found when you've done this work with students, or do you have any data on whether or not those students are more motivated to take further classes in the department?
Right, so by virtue of where these particular courses fall in the curriculum, unless they graduate, they all take more courses. The ones who do graduate then resent graduating, but but for the most part, they all take more courses. What I'm interested in, and these two projects are in development stage right now, so I don't know what the impact will be, but what I am interested in finding out is when we deploy our games, that the students will be able to play through, we're using a platform that is only iOS, but we have tablets that are available, so I mean the access to the technology shouldn't be an issue. But when we add these games to the first and second year curriculum, I'd be very interested to see what the impact on student motivation and retention is, to see if, and we are trying to do a variety of other things in our first 2 years that hopefully will present language learning as more than just the traditional language learning, with a lot more, you were saying, constructivist types of activities and a lot more literacy-based types of activities and that kind of thing. So the combination of these two, I'm hoping, will get students to, that coupled with a couple of institutional measures that will ideally put students in front of us earlier in their career at UT, because there was anecdotal evidence that the students delayed taking foreign languages because they were scared it was going to lower their GPA because it's difficult, and because their financial aid is predicated upon their GPA for a lot of it. Then you know, so we've taken a few measures to try to make sure that we get the students in their first or second year in front of us, so that it actually gives them a chance, in the event that they like taking French or another language, to continue and take additional courses, even without necessarily minoring or majoring. I used to be a lot more adamant that the students really should, and if you're going to do this, you should at least get a minor, which is still true to an extent, but I would rather just tell students, just keep on taking the language. I don't care if you take all 18 hours necessary to complete the minor, but just keep on taking one course a semester, so that the more you know about these types of issues, the better off you will be in the end. Now, if you take 2 or 3 more of these courses, and you realize that, hey, you know what? Now I'm only 2 classes away from a minor. Maybe I really should think about this thing. Then so much the better. But I would rather have students continue foreign languages rather than scaring them away by telling them, you have to minor, otherwise I don't want to see you in front of me. You know. So that's my take on this. But I'm hoping that we're going to get these types of, in a couple of years, I'll let you know if we have any demonstrable evidence that this is happening.